I'm Gary Rosen, the editor of Wall Street Journal Weekend Review, and we're here today with Mark Kleiman, a professor of public policy at UCLA. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Gary. How are you?
Good. So you and a couple of your colleagues have written this very provocative piece for us about it, but I think a lot of people are going to come to it and say, oh, enough already, right? We've been talking about the drug war and enforcement for decades now. Is there really anything new to say about it?
Yes, I think there is. That if we get past the argument about whether we should have a drug war or legalize, and turn to things we know how to actually do that could make the problem smaller, we could make the problem smaller. We couldn't make it go away. It's a permanent factor of the human condition. But we could make it manageable rather than unmanageable.
So what's wrong, though, with current policy? So we've invested lots and lots of money in enforcement and interdiction. Drug use seems to have stabilized or leveled off. What's wrong with what we have now?
We have 500,000 people behind bars in the U.S. at any one time for drug dealing. That's more prisoners per capita than any other civilized country has total. Right, so we have more people in prison for drug dealing than Britain has total per capita. The drug war is generating enormous havoc in a small number of poor, mostly urban, mostly minority communities, leading to horrible relations between the community and the police, leading to mass incarceration in those areas. I mean, again, the drug war is only about 20% of our incarceration problem, but it's pretty concentrated. And then there's all the violence south of the border. And Mexico now has the same number of homicides per year we do, with a third the population, and a lot of that has to do with drug dealing to the U.S. Bad guys are making about $60 billion a year selling drugs. That's not so good. And we're not doing very much about alcohol, which is the number one problem drug. Other than that, we're doing great.
So a lot of critics of the current policy of the drug war that's stretched on now for several decades advocate legalization. They say, look, most of these costs, most of the violence come about because we've created this black market with enormous incentives for criminal activity. So what's wrong with their somewhat radical approach of just moving in an entirely different direction?
Well, they're right to say that most of the problems generated by heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine now relate to the fact that they're illegal. But that's because most of the problems that we would be experiencing if they were legal, we're not experiencing. So the reference term here is alcohol. Alcohol we prohibited for a while and then gave up on that. And we legalized a dangerously addictive intoxicant. And the result is that we have about 16 million alcohol abusers at any one time and maybe 3 million abusers of all the hard illicit drugs combined. And what we're getting for the costs of prohibition is keeping the cocaine problem smaller than the alcohol problem.
Alcohol is a crucial case for you. And you talk about how some clever people in other different parts of the country have gone about dealing with the worst of the alcohol problem. And you take a principle from this, which social scientists call the Pareto Principle, but which seems to have a lot to do with your approach to dealing not just with alcohol, but with the hard drugs more generally.
Right. So Pareto's law, the Pareto Principle, is actually something else. He was a very clever guy. Pareto's law says that for lots of activities, the 20% of the people who engage most frequently are 80% of the total activity. So 80% of the alcohol consumed in the U.S. is consumed by the 20% heaviest drinkers. So when the booze companies tell you that they're in favor of moderate drinking, they must mean they're planning to go out of business, because it's not moderate drinking that keeps those breweries alive. The same thing's true for the illicit drugs. Most people who use illicit drugs don't do so addictively. So we need policies that concentrate on that 20%, both keeping the number of those people down and controlling their behavior. With alcohol in South Dakota, Larry Long invented the 24/7 sobriety program, which says if you're a repeat alcohol offender, drunk driving, or drunken assault, you can come in twice a day for an alcohol test, breathalyzer test, instead of going to prison. people who do that test clean more than 99% of the time, and that seems to reduce their additional drunk driving and their new arrests. Not to zero, right? They're not Rotarians. But it turns out you can actually get chronic heavy drinkers to stop drinking.
And so that's genuine improvement with respect to alcohol. Has anyone tried to replicate that approach with drugs?
Or as I would say, with the illicit drugs, because of course alcohol is a drug. And the answer is yes. We've got a program in Hawaii called HOPE, and there's a variant of that in Tarrant County, Texas, and in Sacramento and in Seattle, which says to drug-abusing felons on probation or parole, you have to stop using. You have to come in randomly when called for a drug test. If you don't come in, or if you come in and you're dirty, you're going to jail that night. And it looks like about 80% of them stop without treatment. And the ones who won't stop without treatment, then you send them to treatment, rather than insisting that everybody who uses the drug has to go to drug treatment, which they don't.
Yeah, no, those are very impressive numbers, and it sounds like it depends on giving more tools to the people who have the responsibility of supervising the population of people on probation and parole.
Right. They need to have the capacity to do swift and certain sanctions, which means they need to have the capacity to do mild sanctions, so that you can't do something severe either quickly or frequently. And what a probation officer really needs is the capacity to impose a criminal justice timeout on a probationer who's not keeping the rules. And most places that doesn't exist.
It seems like one of the other big ongoing costs of illegal drug trafficking is violence in our cities, especially in inner city neighborhoods. And you have some interesting cases of programs that seem to have a positive effect on that very serious problem.
Right. There are at least three different ways to get at the violence problem. One focuses on the market, one focuses on the organization, and one focuses on the individual. At the market level, David Kennedy's drug market intervention, which was first tried in High Point about 8 years ago and has been replicated dozens of times since, identify the market area that's generating the violence. So it's open dealing or it's crack houses as opposed to discrete transactions. Identify the dealer, work with the neighborhood to make sure they're behind you in breaking up the market, and that's going to require some, if you will, community organizing. Once that's done, identify all of the dealers. There aren't very many of them because the market can't support many dealers at any one time. Make cases against all of them, that is, they buy drugs from them undercover. And when you're ready to put every single dealer in prison, you don't. You figure out which ones are violent, and you make the cases against them and put them away. And you call the rest in for a meeting and say, okay, here's the evidence against you. We could send you to prison tomorrow. If you're out there dealing tomorrow, we will send you to prison. This market is closed. You're no longer in the drug dealing business. Here are your community neighbors demanding that you stop and offering you help. Take your pick.
Is there a political constituency for this? Because we have been locked in this very familiar, tiresome debate between drug warriors and drug legalizers for several decades now. There seems to be some great satisfaction that people on opposite sides of the political spectrum or on the opposite sides of this issue take in making a moralistic stand on these issues. You're all about compromise and practicality. Where's the political advantage in that?
Well, we'll get to find out, I guess. But remember that the drug warrior versus legalizer debate exists entirely in the media and to some extent in academia. Right? It's not out there publicly at all. As far as I know, there is no elected official in the U.S. who advocates the legalization of cocaine. And that's purely a fantasy project by people who don't have to actually do anything. But yes, they managed to take a lot of the media oxygen away from discussing practical reforms. And look, you're completely right. We've got reforms that don't fit on bumper stickers. And whether we can find space for them in the political and media environment we now live in is a good question. At the moment, we're not mostly worrying about that. We're mostly worried about getting some programs up and running and done and evaluated. And we're hoping that if we can show the results to people, they'll say, oh, all right, let's try that.
Well, terrific, Mark. It's a very provocative piece. I'm sure it will spark a great deal of discussion. We are delighted to have it on our cover for Wall Street Journal Weekend Review.